Thank you very much, Mr. President, and I certainly thank you for your warm welcome. I also acknowledge our distinguished co-chair, Lady Ernest Solberg, and certainly all of the other stakeholders, all of the other distinguished ladies and gentlemen. Excellencies, we were honored to co-chair the high-level panel on the development of a multi-dimensional vulnerability index, MVI. We worked with a panel of highly skilled and qualified individuals spanning both the technical and political realms of this issue. We are therefore pleased to officially present to the General Assembly the panel's final report. This is the only report to which you should refer moving forward. And let me just emphasize the point here that the previous final report was an unedited report, and this one that has been presented today has been edited to ensure better readability and obviously to make sure that the report itself does not have a lot of duplicated information. So again, I emphasize that this is indeed the final report. The report is the result of almost 2 years of intense work by the panel, supported by the Secretariat. We are very pleased with this product, and we invite you to explore what has been developed and to consider its implications. After more than 30 years of advocacy for a more comprehensive assessment of a country's well-being, that moves beyond the confines of gross national income GNI per capita, the United Nations has finally developed a sound international benchmark, and we are pleased to have steered this groundbreaking process. Let me recap the legislative and other background for our work, which began with the recommendations from the Secretary General's report 75/215, including the principles which guided our work. And I will certainly come back to the principles later. We were established by Resolution 76/203, and our first output was our interim report in August of 2022. Following the interim report, Member States, through Resolution 77/245, supported the definitions and two-level structure as the basis for further work, and instructed us to continue in accordance with our terms of references. It is very clear that national level poverty, often measured by GNI per capita, is indeed a weak measure of material welfare or well-being. This is especially so for countries facing high risk of external shocks, particularly from climate change effects. In addition, countries with structural risk of lower well-being also deserve special assistance, especially if countries structurally lack resilience. However, there is currently no international widely accepted quantitative benchmark to measure structural vulnerability or lack of resilience across multiple dimensions of sustainable development at a national level. Hence, the MVI fills this gap. It allows for a recognition that a country's vulnerabilities to exogenous shocks and stresses as impediments to its sustainable development and should be taken into account in determining its eligibility for development assistance, particularly if it also lacks inherent resilience. The design of the MVI follows 5 principles in accordance with the recommendations of the Secretary General. These include multidimensionality, universality, exogeneity, evidence-based, and simplicity. And insofar as the multi-dimensional aspect is concerned, the indicators are drawn from all 3 dimensions of sustainable development, that is social, environmental, and economic. And in order for the index to be universal, it had to cover, and it does cover, all developing countries. So I want to emphasize here that this is not a SIDS-specific index. This is an index that covers the vulnerabilities of all developing countries. And insofar as exogeneity is concerned, to be effectively used as a tool which is universally accepted as a benchmark measure. The MVI reflects the structural challenges faced by countries, irrespective of their current policies and the political will of their governments. So just to emphasize here that the index is not designed to, let's say, assist governments that involve in bad policies to get funding. And I should make the point here too that the MVI does not guarantee a country getting any form of funding, but we'll get to that point a little later. At the same time, it avoids considering too many factors, especially those that are only loosely connected to vulnerability, as this may lead to the development of an index that reflects the general progress towards the SDGs, rather than a genuine structural MVI. And what we're trying to do here is to get a genuine structural MVI to determine the vulnerabilities of developing countries. And as I said before, it is evidence-based, and it's also relatively simple, so that the information could be easily assimilated. Now, the MVI has two pillars: structural vulnerability and the lack of structural resilience. Each of these two pillars have three dimensions: economic, environmental, and social resilience, representing its inherent and inherited factors. We define structural vulnerability as the risk of a country's sustained development being hindered by recurrent adverse exogenous shocks and stresses. Structural resilience is defined as the inherent characteristics or inherited capacity of countries to withstand, absorb, recover from, or for that matter to minimize the adverse effects of shocks or stresses. With inherent, we mean factors or conditions that are permanent or almost permanent. They are exogenous in nature. Inherited factors or conditions are those that change slowly over time. For the calculation of the MVI, we use lack of resilience. This has resulted in greater coherence and technical soundness. The primary objective of the MVI is not to reflect overall progress towards SDGs, but to provide a robust, acceptable, and simplified assessment of vulnerability that can be effectively operationalized by and for the benefit of vulnerable countries. The MVI is not intended to replace the GNI per capita or other relevant developmental measures, but to complement and to provide a more accurate picture for decision making. Again, I want to re-emphasize this point that the MVI is not intended to replace the GNI per capita or other relevant measures, but to complement and to provide a more accurate picture for decision making. And I'll certainly get back to this point later. As shown on the slide, the MVI focuses the narrative around the concepts instead of putting the focus on a seemingly imbalanced and non-exhaustive list of individual indicators. The MVI framework is simple. Each dimension of vulnerability and resilience is characterized by three concepts, and yet 18 in total. On the technical side, it also allows for a simpler and more balanced aggregation. The MVI has 26 indicators. The information on the slide may be a bit hazy, but you can find the full list of indicators on the OHR, LLS, and DESA websites. The results are available on the Secretary's website through a data visualization tool. A lower MVI score indicates that a country is relatively less vulnerable compared to its counterparts. However, this does not imply that a country is completely shielded or immune to the impact of external shocks. It is worth noting that while some countries may possess non-structural capabilities to mitigate their vulnerabilities, their underlying structural vulnerability persists. Therefore, the MVI should be regarded as a single measure, albeit a multidimensional one, and serves as a valuable addition to existing measures and discourse. Another observation we made is that for countries in the middle of the score distribution, scores are not very different. For example, the difference in scores for the country ranked 13 and the one that's ranked 21 is 2 points, which is less than half of a standard deviation for those statisticians in the audience. Colleagues, our process was rigorous. For example, we conducted some sensitivity analysis, including checking out data and testing the procedures selected. We examined the relationship between the MVI and income, and it turns out that this connection is not very strong and lacks statistical significance, which is precisely what we're looking for. I mean, we wanted an index that could complement the GNI per capita without repeating the same information. So again, just to emphasize that the MVI actually complements the GNI. So they are two different lenses, one based on vulnerability and the other based on income. Finally, the MVI results by country characteristics show that on average, LDCs, LLDCs, and SIDS are the most vulnerable groups. The next slide shows more detailed results on the LDCs and SIDS. And just to give a little analysis as to the rankings, we found that 63% of all LDCs have above the median MVI score, while 70% of all SIDS have scores above the median, indicating that these groups are more likely to be found in the upper levels of the MVI. So there's no displacement in ranking. In fact, the MVI findings are consistent, similar to the income measures, other than it is looking through the vulnerability lens to determine need. Now, the first column in the table shows that the LDCs that have scores above the median have disproportionately higher scores, as almost 20% are in the top decile of the whole distribution and 30% in the top quintile. So again, it confirms that the MVI truly complements the GNI, and that it does not preclude any country from receiving the ODA support that they are currently receiving. What it does is that it also recognizes the vulnerabilities of developing countries and has the capacity to include some small island states that hitherto may have been omitted and based on their relatively high per capita income. And as we have said before, that's not using GNI is not a particularly good measure of development, and therefore taking the vulnerability into consideration and the lack of resilience, that's certainly a more equitable measure to ensure that is inclusion.